The first icon of evolution I wrote about was the Miller-Urey experiment from 1953. Darwin himself actually didn't talk much about the origin of life. His theory began with the first living cell and went from there on. But he hinted, Darwin that is, hinted at the origin of life in what he called warm little pond. In the 1930s, various people came up with an idea that life began on the early Earth when lightning created organic molecules in the atmosphere, which then dissolved in the ocean to form what they called a primordial soup. Well, this was all hypothetical until Stanley Miller in 1953 performed an experiment in which he put in a glass apparatus a mixture of gases that he and others thought represented the early Earth's atmosphere. And then he shot an electric spark through that and collected the products in water at the bottom of the apparatus. And after about a week, he was able to detect two of the simplest amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. When I wrote Icons of Evolution in 2000, many biology textbooks had images of the Miller-Urey experiment, because although Darwinian evolution doesn't start till after the origin of life, there was this grand evolutionary story that the textbooks wanted to tell, and the Miller-Urey experiment was part of that story. There are many problems with the Miller-Urey experiment. He used a mixture of gases, methane, ammonia, water vapor, and hydrogen in his apparatus that many scientists at the time thought represented the early Earth's atmosphere. But by a decade later, most geoscientists, or many geoscientists, were convinced that the early atmosphere was not like that at all. First of all, it seems there was probably some oxygen present. Well, if you had put oxygen in the Miller-Urey apparatus with hydrogen and then shot a spark through it, the thing would have blown up. So oxygen had to be excluded. And yet it appears now that probably there was some oxygen in the early atmosphere. The early atmosphere apparently was not rich in hydrogen. Most geoscientists now think the early atmosphere consisted of the same gases that come out of volcanoes in the modern world. And those gases are water vapor, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen. Well, if you put those gases into the Miller-Urey apparatus and shoot a spark through them, you don't get any amino acids at all. You have to have some free hydrogen present. So when you put a realistic mixture of gases in the Miller-Urey apparatus, you don't get anything like the building blocks of life. And so the experiment appears now to be irrelevant to the origin of life. But there's an even more serious problem. Even if someone could show, and every now and then someone publishes a paper claiming to show, that certain basic building blocks of life could form under pre-life conditions without any sort of intelligent design or intervention. Even if we could show that, we would still be immeasurably far from creating a living cell. And here's how we know that. And this was published even before Icons of Evolution. If you take a little flask, a little test tube, and you put in a sterile buffer that's a salt solution with no living thing in it at all, then you add one living cell to that sterile solution, and you poke a hole with a sterile needle. The contents of the cell will leak out into the buffer, and you have in your hand all the molecules you need for a living cell, because the cell was just alive a minute ago. Not just the building blocks, the DNA, the proteins, the membranes, everything is there. And yet, every scientist knows you cannot put that back together and make a living cell out of it. I call it the Humpty Dumpty experiment. So even if we could show how all the chemical building blocks of life formed on the early Earth without any intelligence or design, we would still be immeasurably far from understanding how life began. Because we can have all the chemicals present and still not know how to make a living cell. The whole thing remains a mystery.